Welcome, welcome. Find a seat. Also, you can get up and move around. That won't bother me. If you want to get coffee, if you need a tinkle, whatever you're gonna do. Welcome to the Village Central Teaching. We are currently continuing our series that we've titled The Good Shepherd, going through a variety of texts throughout the Bible where God reveals himself using this kind of imagery as a good shepherd. And so, to recap, and Todd shared this last week, we have two main goals of this series and of our time together. The first is that we want to understand how God has revealed his heart for his people through Good Shepherd imagery. And so that'll take a little bit of literary analysis, which I'm sure you're all geared up and excited for. I know it gets my juices going. But we'll see, not just this week, but in the coming weeks, that this is a core image of God as he presents himself to his people as a good shepherd. And it's a 1,000-year journey from Psalm 23, which we studied last time, all the way up through the New Testament. Our other goal is that we would experience God's timeless direction and care in our contemporary setting. So, this book's really old. In fact, many people discard this book because it's so old. And, what does the Bible have to say about iPhones? What does the Bible have to say about monitoring how much you're on the internet, right? Like it can seem like it's an outdated book, but what we'll see is that God's care for us and his wisdom to us is applicable in our day and age, maybe even more than ever. And we see that he still invites us to trust him as our good shepherd. And so in the coming weeks, we're going to go over 9 key passages. Today we will be in Jeremiah 23. So if you've got a Bible, open it up. We'll be in Jeremiah 23. And so 4 of these passages come from the Old Testament, or they come from pre-Jesus, and then 5 are from the New Testament, where it's Jesus' own life and even after. And a lot of the material that we're using, Todd and I both, is coming from a book by Kenneth Bailey. It's called The Good Shepherd. And so, if you want to get it, highly recommend it. It's a great book. And I want to give you a quick background on Kenneth Bailey because he has a perspective that's pretty unique. So he's passed away now. He was an author, a lecturer, and a professor. He spent 7 years of his childhood in the village of Edmu in the province of Minya, which is in Egypt. He spent 10 years with rural churches of the Egyptian Evangelical Church. He then spent 20 years in Lebanon and another 10 years living and teaching near Bethlehem, near where Israel and Palestine are today. And in his words, where he lived was where shepherds grazed their flocks around us. And so he spent 40 years living and teaching in institutes in Egypt, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Syria. And so, in his own words, here's how he described his perspective. Thus, for nearly 50 years, Middle Eastern shepherds with their flocks were a part of the larger context in which I grew up and then lived and taught the New Testament. It was my privilege to have laymen and clergy in 3 countries as my students who had actually herded sheep for extended periods in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so this isn't some academic who's writing about cultures he's only read about and he's just like study. It's like, no, he's lived in this context. He's breathed their air. He's studied their languages. He's lived with actual shepherds. And so this picture of God as the good shepherd, it kind of misses us because does anyone here know a shepherd, a sheep herder? Like we kind of misses us because it's not as common now, but back in biblical times and even today in the Middle East, it is um, almost a social institution, or it's a core career. It has been in that area. And so, in our time together today, we will be in Jeremiah 23. And so last week, and actually, let me see here. I'm going to stop here. Why don't we have a few people pray for us, and then we will get rolling to see what Jeremiah has to tell us about God as the Good Shepherd. So we're going to be talking about Jeremiah, and so last time we did teaching, Todd walked us through Psalm 23. It's one of the more famous psalms. You've likely seen a coffee cup or a pillow with something from Psalm 23 on it. And so Todd got to do poetry, which is really fun. And you can generally kind of pick up poetry and generally get the gist of it. And then I got stuck with a historical passage. So we have to do a little bit of work to kind of set the ground for what Jeremiah is going to be saying because he was a real man living in a real place at a real time, talking to real people, addressing real issues. So when you jump into history or historical narrative, if you don't know what's going on, it can be super confusing. So we got to do a little bit of work to make sure we know who's talking and why he's talking and what he's trying to say. And so Jeremiah, he's often called the weeping prophet because of the nature of his prophecies. He lived in Judah during the last 40 years of its existence, which would have been roughly 627 to 586 BC, give or take. For context, Psalm 23, which we'll see come up today in our time together, was written by David roughly 400 years prior to Jeremiah. And so what we'll see is that Jeremiah is certainly intimately familiar with David's poem, even though it's 400 years old. Jeremiah's role was to warn Israel of coming judgment. He would lament over their rebellion, and then he witnesses his forewarnings come to pass. So he tells Israel, this is going to happen, some bad things are coming, and then he actually lives through what he predicted. He warned of God's coming judgment of Israel, predicting that a nation from the north would be coming on its way. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So, as far as the book of Isaiah, as we have it in the Bible, chapter 36 tells us that Jeremiah was told by God to compile his writings. So, to pull together all of his sermons and his poems and his essays in writing. And he actually employs a scribe named Baruch who helps him pull it all together and kind of assemble what we now have today of the book of Jeremiah. And so, if you pick up Jeremiah, it's kind of confusing to read because it's not a chronological history. It doesn't read like, then this happened, and then this happened. It's more of an anthology of Jeremiah's writings. And there's definitely history in there, but understanding it's an anthology helps us understand how to read it properly and correctly. And the intention of the book of Jeremiah is to show that he is a messenger of God's justice and grace, not just to Israel, but also to the nations. And so, what we see in chapters 1 through 24 is that Israel breaks the covenant. So, Jeremiah accuses Israel's leaders, the prophets, the priests, and specifically Israel's kings, of breaking the covenant of God, not holding to what God had called them to live up to. He also accuses them of worshiping other gods. And they worship other gods, and that might sound like, okay, well, God's being a little, you'll hear people say this, like God's just a jealous God, he's insecure, and so like he wants all the praise for himself, and like, it's just like it paints God as this middle school girl who just needs like everyone to love, or middle school boys are insecure too. But what we see is that the worship of other gods was horrific. We have this from Jeremiah 19, where he says this, because they have forsaken me and have made this an alien place and have burned sacrifices in it to other gods that neither they nor their forefathers nor the kings of Judah had ever known. And because they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent and have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, a thing which I never commanded or spoke of, nor did it ever even enter my mind. Therefore, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when this place will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but rather the valley of slaughter. And so if you were with us in our study of Mark, when we talked about when Jesus talks about hell, he actually uses the word Gehenna, and it's a reference to this place. And when Jesus talks about Gehenna, he's referring to Israel's practice of throwing their children into fires to sacrifice them to gods that don't exist. So that's the context. When God is angry with Israel, that's the context here. Israel's kings have, and we see this in Second Kings, which is more of a historical account. We see that Israel's kings have arranged for these child sacrifices to be made. And so you'll hear some contradicting objections from those who don't believe in Jesus or the Bible. They'll either say God is not just because he allows evil, and at the same time, they'll say, but when I read the Bible, he seems really overly angry. And the thing is what we see in the Bible is that when God sees evil in the world that we also recoil at, he's angry at it. He's not mad at people for like stubbing your toe and saying, damn it. That's not what he's angry at. He's angry with his people for throwing their wailing children in fires. Seems pretty reasonable that he's pretty upset. And so Jeremiah describes this enemy from the north who will come and actually will be a tool of God because God will destroy his own temple through this enemy, who we later learn is the nation of Babylon. In chapters 25 through 51, We see Jeremiah proclaim judgment, but also hope for Israel. We also see him proclaim judgment and hope for the nations. Okay, so that's a quick, real fast, just overview of who Jeremiah is, why he's saying what he's saying, who he's speaking to, and the conflicts that are going on at his time. And so the theme of our passage today, if I could real quickly summarize it, is that Jeremiah expresses the good shepherd's displeasure over present suffering while still giving a basis for future hope. I know that's kind of long winded. I'll say it again. Jeremiah expresses the good shepherd's displeasure over present suffering while giving a basis for future hope. And what I love about our passage in Jeremiah today is we see kind of an intersection of the abstract and the applicable. The abstract and the applicable. So, what I mean is, when we read Psalm 23, we get these abstract characteristics of God, that He leads me beside still waters, that He's a good shepherd, that though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And they're beautiful, poetic assurances of God's shepherding heart for His people. But, and if you're right brained, like you're artistic, you love stuff like this. But if you're left brained, you might go, okay, but what does that mean for my life? How does that apply to me? It can be hard to kind of conceptualize how these big ideas of who God is leads its way into our everyday life. And what I love about Jeremiah is that we see him use principles from Psalm 23 to address the actual present sufferings and activities of the people of God. So they're not just nice ideas that make us feel better, they have feet to them. And they matter to us today, and they matter to Israel in his time. And so there's really 5 major themes that can be tracked through our passage today. We see God through Jeremiah address the past and the present by exposing bad shepherds who have scattered the sheep. We see God addressing the present by accusing and threatening those shepherds, which will be fun. We see God enter to gather and to bring back and to provide his own shepherds for his people. We also see the promise of the future that a new good king is to be given via the line of David, who would bring about salvation and security. And in the future, that we would see that there would be a better remembrance for the sheep who were gathered in their own land. I know some of this may not make sense now. It will make sense at the end as we work through these concepts. Okay, deep breath. I know there's a lot of setup, a lot of context, but this is important so we kind of can get our teeth around. Is that the phrase? Sink our teeth into, whatever, however it goes. We really sink our teeth into what Jeremiah is trying to say to Israel in his day and what we can take from that thousands of years later in our day. So I'm going to just read through the passage and then we'll work through it. It's Jeremiah 23, starting in verse 1. We'll go through verse 8. And by the way, this translation is from Kenneth Bailey, who is himself like an expert in the languages of that time. So he translated this himself. I can't relate to that. That's pretty impressive. The amount of work that he's put into this. So if you're reading a Bible, it may look a little bit different, but he's trying to be as faithful to the original languages as possible. Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, an oracle of Jehovah or Yahweh. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the shepherds who shepherd my people, you have scattered my flock and have driven them away, and you have not attended to them. Behold, I will attend to you for your evil deed, an oracle of Yahweh. Then I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. I will set shepherds over them who will shepherd them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing. An oracle of Yahweh. Behold, the days are coming, an oracle of Yahweh, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called: the Lord is our righteousness. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, an oracle of Yahweh, when they shall no longer say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but rather, as the Lord lives, who brought up and gathered the offspring of the house of Israel out of the north country, and out of all the countries where he had driven them. Then they shall dwell in their own land. Okay, so we're going to work through each of those 5 themes kind of step by step and see what we can uncover. So in verse 1, oh, can you still see and hear me? There we go. In verse 1, we see this phrase, an oracle of Yahweh. You see it 5 times throughout the passage. So what's interesting is, oh, there we go. Hold on. My shirt's eating the microphone. Give me a sec. There we go. Oh, come on. Check. There we go. So what we see is this Hebrew term, I knew I was going to struggle, Neum Yahweh or Jehovah, and Bailey has translated this as an oracle of Yahweh, and most translations will say something like declares the Lord. But Hebrew actually does not have a verb; it literally translates as oracle of Yahweh. An oracle might seem like a strange word to us, but it was not to Israel. Many churches, if you've been to churches that do this, they'll conclude reading the Bible by saying, "This is the word of the Lord." This is a pretty close idea to that. That when Jeremiah speaks, he's saying, "This is the word of God. This is God's word to his people." And so each time it's said, it marks out a distinct message or theme that's being communicated. And I just wanted to address that up front because I know as we're reading, it's like, what's this phrase over and over in brackets showing up? That's what it is. It's Jeremiah asserting this is the word of the Lord with every claim that he makes. So you see this proclamation of woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep. In Psalm 23, there is only the good shepherd. There is no mention of bad shepherds, but Jeremiah dives right in and talks about the bad shepherds first. And these shepherds who destroy would have been the kings of Israel who had reversed the King Josiah's reforms. King Josiah was the last good king of Israel. He hadn't been around for a while at this point, and the kings who came after him reversed Josiah's commands to do wicked things like the sacrifice of children, like idolatry, like many other practices. And under their leadership, we also see the neglect of the poor, the widow, and the orphans. And so we see that there's social injustice across God's people, that the lowly are neglected, although they were commanded to look out for their lowly brothers and sisters. So, one conclusion we can make right away from the first verse here is that God wants to expose evil leaders. Few things will inspire God's anger like those who are in high positions who use that position and that influence to their own benefit at the expense of others. In fact, 600 years later, Jesus pronounces similar woes upon the Pharisees, who would have been the religious elites in his day. Jesus says this. Jesus replied, "And you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens that they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs." And then skipping down a little bit, woe to you experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who are entering. And so Jesus has an anger towards those who have positions of influence, who instead of using that position and that influence to benefit and bless God's people, use it to their own selfish gain. And in our context today, 2,000 years later, aren't we a little tired of all of the headlines about priests and pastors and politicians and those in positions of power and influence being caught in their scandal, being caught um, in abusing people, taking advantage of people? And we can start to feel like, where is God in all of this? Why is he showing up? Why isn't he doing anything about this? But what we see from this passage and many others is that God is not passive about wicked leaders taking advantage of people. In fact, a central theme of Scripture is God saying he will hold them accountable for their wickedness, as we're about to see. God goes on, he says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the shepherds who shepherd my people, you've scattered my flock and have driven them away, and you have not attended them to them. Behold, I will attend to you for your evil deed." And so it's kind of subtle here. We miss it in the English translation, but this is kind of a sarcasm from God. When God says, "The shepherds who shepherd my people," they're not really shepherding the people. So this is God's way of kind of ironically or sarcastically saying, "All right, shepherds, you've scattered my, how's that shepherding going? You've scattered my flock. You've driven them away." And then we get this ominous warning: you have not attended to them, therefore I will attend to you. To put it another way, you haven't taken care of your responsibilities, so I'm going to take care of you. I mean, this is a threat from God, again, towards those who would abuse and neglect those that they were actually supposed to care for from the charge of God. And man, I want to spend more time on this, but Todd's teaching next week or in a couple weeks where he'll go over Ezekiel. It'll delve a little bit more deeply into this idea of God holding leaders accountable. I'm jealous. I really wish I could go off, but I can't. So I just want to say this and then we'll keep going here. For anyone here who has been hurt by those who should have been the source of healing, I want you to hear me say this: that God sees their wickedness. No one has ever gotten away with it. According to God, if he is who he says he is, he will hold them accountable. And he sees their wickedness. What's done in the dark will be brought to the light. God sees your woundedness. He sees your pain. He sees your grieving. And he wants to meet you in that. If you look at the life of Jesus over and over again, he is going to those who have been deeply wounded. That's who draws the heart of God. I want you to know that God will hold them accountable better than you can. That is a responsibility and a weight that you cannot bear. And as much as vengeance may feel good in the moment, it leaves us emptier than when we started. God is holy. God will hold them accountable. And trust me, he'll do a better job than you or I can. And I want you to know that God will heal you better than anyone else can. That wherever your brokenness is, whatever your suffering is, that he promises that he can bring about healing in your life. And that's not easy, and it's not like it happens in a moment and just like a magical silver bullet. It's a lifetime of walking with God and getting to know him and allowing his love to enter into that wound and bring about healing. Let's keep going here. So we now see that God will enter to gather his people. Says, then I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them, and I will bring them back, shuv, which is Hebrew, to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. And so God himself takes ownership. One of the things I appreciate about God is he doesn't shy away from his actions. He goes, oh, I drove them out. Yeah, that was me. I worked through the Babylonians. This didn't, like, nothing happens without God's approval. God's not like going, the Babylonians showed up? Oh, crap. Like, he's not caught off guard. And so God is saying, yes, I am at work in this. And not only am I at work in what has happened, I am at work in what is coming, which is I will gather my people back to myself. God does not abandon his people. Even as they are desperately wicked, God has a plan to restore and reconcile them to himself because he keeps his covenant even when his people do not. That should be relieving to every walking believer in this room. God keeps his covenant even when we do not. God says that he will bring them back or shuv to their fold, which you could also translate as their land, so that they can fulfill the original commandment given to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. And by the way, this is the same language as Psalm 23, which we studied last time. In Psalm 23, verse 3, when it says, he restores my soul, the root word of restore there is shuv. He brings back my soul. He repairs it. He restores me. He heals my soul. And so Jeremiah is saying that God himself will restore and will heal his people because the shepherds dropped the ball. So he's like, I'll do it myself. God not only enters to gather, he enters to provide. He says, I will set shepherds over them who will shepherd them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing. An oracle of Yahweh. And so God gives new shepherds. He establishes new shepherds to care for and watch over his people. And this is one of the ways that he is caring for his people today, that he's given shepherds to care for and watch over his people. And I know for us, the instinct is to go, well, according to the news headlines, that's not going real well. It seems like every other shepherd is fleecing the flock. But I'll tell you this, for every news headline you see about some idiot who's taking advantage of his people, there's 400 pastors you'll never hear about who are working diligently on behalf of their people, as imperfectly as they might be doing, as best they can, trying to be faithful to what God's called them to. I mean, I'll tell you this, as someone who has briefly been in a small leadership position in a small church, like that weighs on me. The fact that God will hold, I'll stand before the king and give an account for how I handle the responsibility of caring for his people. Like these idiots who take advantage of their people don't recognize that they're going to be held accountable by the king. Again, that's Todd's teaching. Stop it, Jason. Let's keep going. Okay. It says, they shall fear no more nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing. And so, again, this should call back Psalm 23 that we will fear no more. And in fact, it's one of the more obvious links to Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And if you remember from Todd's teaching, one of the big conclusions of Psalm 23 is that we can live a life free from fear, that we can find security in our good shepherd. And that is what Jeremiah is promising for the people of God, that they would be restored and that they would not fear anymore nor be dismayed, nor shall any be missing, which, by the way, is also a callback to verse 3. Whenever it says, he restores my soul, he brings me back. So David, you know the story of David, long story short, guy's a bum. He sleeps with another man's wife, gets her pregnant, has her husband killed, and then he's called a man after God's own heart. And you're like, no, he's not. He's a man after booty. Like, he's not after God's own heart, right? Well, so how can God say that David is a man after God's own heart? Because David repents and turns back to God. And God says, those who turn back to me, I will remember their sins no more. I will wash them anew. And so it's not that David is righteous. He's very much unrighteous. It's that God is righteous and yet gracious and will welcome us back in when we return to him. So neither shall any be missing. There's no one missing from the flock. God's not like Jason with his keys. God's not looking around going, where's Tommy? We misplaced Tommy. He knows exactly where all of his people are. And so what we've seen so far is that God, through Jeremiah, has now exposed the wickedness and suffering caused by Israel's leaders. He's accused them and ensured their judgment, and he's promised that he himself will enter the fray to bring about healing and restoration. And now is where it gets good, because now he turns the point to the future and what is to come. Jeremiah dreams of a righteous branch that God will raise up for David, meaning he will be a descendant from David's line. And so you can think of the idea of branch kind of like a family tree. And so this descendant will reign as king, and he will deal wisely and execute justice in the land. And there's actually another example of God's subtle sarcasm in the Hebrew that we just miss. It's really cool. So at the end of verse 6, when he says, he will be called the Lord is our righteousness, the term there is Yahweh Sekednu. And this is actually a play on words of the current king of Israel at the time, Zedekiah. Zedekiah's name means Yahweh is my righteousness. And so Jeremiah is kind of poking fun at Zedekiah and saying, actually, the king to come will actually live as if God is his righteousness. The king to come who will actually live up to his name, because you don't live up to your name. Again, we missed that in the English translation. That blew my mind when I read that. I was like, that's so cool. But I'm a nerd. So, and so a question that you might have, sorry, I'm being bad about getting the next thing up. A question that you might have as you read this is, well, who is this king that Jeremiah is speaking of? Because we're not doing kings anymore. We're doing presidents. It's going really well. It'd be nice to have a king come along as described here, right? We're going to come back to this later. Who is this king that Jeremiah is speaking of? Well, Jeremiah goes on and he says, therefore, behold, the days are coming when they shall no longer say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but rather, as the Lord lives, who brought up and gathered the offspring of the house of Israel out of the north country, out of all the countries where he had driven them, then they shall dwell in their own land. So remember, Jeremiah has made predictions that the north country is going to come in, they're going to destroy God's temple, they're going to sack Jerusalem, and the people of God will be taken away as slaves. And Jeremiah himself would actually live through this period. And so it's generally thought, and so the king of the Babylonians would go on to, Nebuchadnezzar would go on to spare Jeremiah's life, but then Jeremiah is kind of kidnapped by some rebel fellow Jewish people. They kidnap him and they take him to Egypt. And according to tradition and extra biblical Jewish sources, Jeremiah dies. He is stoned to death by his fellow countrymen who are tired of him yapping out and calling him out and stuff. Just to be clear, it's according to tradition, but it seems to make sense. I mean, if you read Jeremiah, the dude doesn't hold back. He calls everyone out. And so Jeremiah, again, as someone who was going to live through this horrific event in Israel's history, being overtaken by a foreign nation, dragged away, the temple of God being destroyed, and being taken away as slaves. He sounds weirdly hopeful here. He sounds like he's saying, in fact, what he says is kind of crazy given his context and his audience. And Kenneth Bailey puts it better than I could. He says this: "It is amazing to contemplate the strong faith and unshakable hope of a man who can compose such a text while living in a doomed city about to fall. The sack of the city was inevitable, and anyone alive after it was over would most likely face a lifetime of slavery in a foreign land. How many of them would die on the trek to Babylon?" Jeremiah exhibits raw courage and greatness of heart. Not only is he saying all things will yet be well, but he is also affirming that the return from Babylon will exceed in greatness the exodus from Egypt. If you know anything about the Jewish people and their history, that's a crazy claim. The return from Babylon will exceed the exodus from Egypt. In short, the text can be understood to mean God got us out of Egypt with the parting of the Red Sea, the drowning of Pharaoh's army, the giving of the law, and all of that. But the return from Babylon will overshadow those astounding events. In the future, when you make an oath, you will swear by the God who brought you back from Babylon, not Egypt. Exodus may be the central story of the Jewish people. Like if you like, how many people here are familiar with the Exodus story of the Jews being released from Egypt? Just a quick survey, real quick. Okay, how many people feel like you know the story of Babylonian captivity and all of its nuances? Right? It's like we don't know it quite as well. Like Exodus is like the story, and yet Jeremiah is saying, no, 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 it's going to be even better when God brings us back from Babylon. It's a testament to Jeremiah's unshakable hope in the Good Shepherd who does not abandon his people. But there's an objection that some of you may feel, and that's something I felt as I read this. Like, isn't this a bit dismissive of their suffering, of the suffering to come? Like, some of us have experienced this in the midst of grief that well meaning but probably naive believers might throw around spiritual platitudes as though it's supposed to help. So, in the midst of grief, they might go, let go and let God, and God has a plan, and everything's going to work out. Like, this can kind of feel that way a little bit. This is how I read it as I was reading this text. It can feel dismissive, but it's not. It actually acknowledges how difficult the suffering is and how deep it goes. And again, Bailey is smarter than I am, so I will just read what he has to say. He does not say, Jeremiah does not say, never forget the horrors of the siege and fall of the city. How much they had suffered was not forgotten. I would say it could not be forgotten. But neither was it their primary focus. Rather, Jeremiah tells the people that one day they will be able to look back and remember the Lord who brought his people back out of the north country. What mattered was their redemption and their redeemer, not their suffering. There is no nursing of community grievances, only gratitude of divine intervention. In other words, Jeremiah is calling the people to say, look beyond the suffering. It's real, it's difficult, and the only way you can get through it is if you look beyond it to see God who stands above and outside of that suffering, who gives us hope. It does not negate the reality of present suffering, it provides endurance to persevere well. This hope is what drives Paul hundreds of years later to write this in his letter to the Romans. He says, not only that, but we being the Christian community, rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. And if you know who Paul is and you know who he's writing to, that's a big claim to make. Paul suffered more than any of us in this room ever will. He was beaten. He gets run out of every town he goes to. He gets shipwrecked. He gets bitten by a snake. I mean, it's like every imaginable form of suffering, he endures it. And he says, how do we react to it? We rejoice. We rejoice because we know that this is building up in us an unshakable confidence that God is who he says he is. In another place, there's a spot, I can't remember if it's Hebrews or where, but it says that when the people of God and Christians were, they were beaten, they beat the mess out of these people and they let them go. And it says they left rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. That's a radical kind of faith and hope that allows, like, if I get the mess beaten out of me, I don't know that I'm going to handle that all that well. They walk out rejoicing, but that's not because they're great. That's because God is great and their hope is in Him who delivers on His promises. And so I want to quote a theologian, Croatian theologian, Miroslav Volf. He was born in war-torn Croatia during the Croatian-Yugoslavian conflict, and he was a first-hand witness of the many horrors of war. He is now a professor at Yale University, professor of theology. He has this to say about suffering and how we process suffering. We will not forget so as to be able to rejoice. We will rejoice and therefore let those memories slip out of our minds. The reason for our non remembrance of wrongs will be the same as its cause. Our minds will be wrapped in the goodness of God and the goodness of God's new world. And the memories of wrongs will wither away like plants without water. So you can't just remove, you have to replace. You'll hear people use phrases like this phrase. Like, it isn't just about removing. You don't just magically make yourself not feel suffering. You have to look beyond the suffering and get to know the Creator and His promises that replace that suffering with a better hope, that provides you with an endurance that steals the soul. It doesn't mean you don't feel wounds. It means you can develop a perseverance that goes deeper than circumstance. That's what God promises. And that's what Jeremiah is casting a vision for the people of God as they're about to go into, decades of suffering under Babylonian captivity. So to recap, our theme today was the Good Shepherd's displeasure over present suffering while still providing a basis for future hope. And so there's a few conclusions we can draw here as we wrap up our time. One, leadership failure is a serious matter. God sees it and God will address it. I'm going to stop myself there. Communities can be lost, not just individuals. So God doesn't just speak to individuals, He speaks to a people. And He promises that He's making for Himself a people, and we are not individualistic creatures. We are social creatures. Like, we're designed for community. And so God has created for Himself a people and invites us to be a part of that people. This people or this flock belongs to God, not to the shepherds. God takes ownership of caring for His people when the shepherds fall short. In the midst of devastation, hope can persevere. Jeremiah exhibits incredible faith and courage that's rooted in God, who stands above all the carnage. We see that freedom from fear is central to all meaningful life. It's mentioned in Psalm 23, it's mentioned in Jeremiah 23. That we need not fear as followers of God. And perhaps the most crucial conclusion is that incarnation is the only solution. So Jeremiah was certain that God Himself would appear to gather and bring back the flock that still belonged to Him. So stupid, but in the words of Thanos, fine, I'll do it myself. Like, that's God's attitude here. He's like, fine, these people aren't getting it together. I'm going to step into creation. I'm going to do it myself. Did you just compare God to Thanos? Yeah, kind of did. He gets what I'm getting at, I think. Hopefully you do. So one of the things about this series that's going to be tough is like not giving away future teachings, because there's a teaching coming on John 10 in a few months that like would be perfect right here. I'm not going to give it away. I'm going to show self-restraint. So I'm going to close with another prophet's writings about the coming Messiah King, who Jeremiah promised. Isaiah 11, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. Again, it's a different prophet than Jeremiah. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. We believe that Jesus was this Messiah. We believe that Jesus was this Messiah King. He fulfilled so many prophecies that it's unbelievable to think it was a coincidence. When he came, he proclaimed life to the poor. He proclaimed freedom to the prisoners. He proclaimed healing to the sick. He fulfilled so many prophecies about this Messiah King. I'd love to talk to you about some of those if you're interested. And so in his letter to the Colossians, Paul puts this in pretty epic terms. It's one of my favorite passages in the Bible. The Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones, powers, rulers, or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might be preeminent. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things. It's the same message of Jeremiah 23, that God will reconcile his people to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Jeremiah is described as a prophet to Israel and to the nations, and we are the nations. And so today we know that the gospel of Jesus Christ stands true, that we can be reconciled to God through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you're interested in talking about that, I'd love to talk with you about what this new life looks like and this hope that can steel you for what may come. God never promises that suffering won't come. In fact, Jesus literally tells his followers, suffering is coming. God promises to be with us in the midst of suffering and gives us hope to be able to endure and look to the future of what he promised. And that's what I've got. So why don't we have so